Welcome to the Rays of Hope this week. This is the program where we hold conversations, we invite guests, we build on stories and narratives that are meant to inspire courage, resilience, and most importantly, hope. And this week we are very honored to be doing this Rays of Hope in conjunction with the Youth Department as we hold the Y Summit this week. This is the virtual conference for young people, and we are very, very glad that you are following. Young people out there, parents, guardians, and we are very much invited. Also remember that you can follow this program on our social media platforms. You can follow on YouTube and you can follow on Facebook. That is CAC TV Kenya. Most welcome. Please call a friend, tell a friend to tell a friend that this show is happening. And today we are going to be discussing questions of faith. In fact, hard questions of faith. And we have a very good panel here that will help us expound on these questions that we've had at the back of our minds, these questions that we keep asking ourselves. But just to get us going, we need to get to know our guests. So from my immediate right, please introduce yourself to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is John Njoroge. I work with a ministry called Ravi Zacharias International Ministries that is based in Atlanta, Georgia. But 4 years ago, my family and I moved back to Kenya. We are based here now, and we do talk a lot about questions of faith. Our goal is to help people come to know Jesus Christ, and so we listen to the questions they have. We try to respond the best way that we can, because we do believe that there are answers to the issues that we face as human beings in this world. So again, John Njoroge, so honored to be here today.
Asante sana, and most welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Next.
All right. Hello, viewers. My name is Bill Dindi. I am honored to be here as well. I work with Life Ministry Kenya. I've been working with them for the past 10 years. I'm in charge of the Student Ministry Department, and as such, keep interacting with difficult questions from the students. And so out of necessity, a few years ago, we began an initiative we called Apologetics Kenya, which has since morphed into an organization of its own right. We engage skeptics and people with questions on the faith. I'm married to Nancy and blessed with 2 kids, and I'm pretty sure they are watching, so glad to be here, and thank you.
Karibu sana, and thank you for the partnership that we've continued to have also with your ministries. The theme of the Y Summit this year, and specifically this week, is anchored on Judges 6 and verse 14. Allow me to read Judges 6 and verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have." In other versions, go in the might that you have, and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Am I not sending you? And actually the clarion call this week to the young people is, become a champion. I am a champion. And that's where we're going to base even our conversation. But so I want us just to reflect on that just very briefly. What does it mean for a young person to become a champion of faith? Perhaps Billy, want to start us off.
All right. As I reflect on that, and by the way, that's a fantastic theme. I think it's very pertinent. It speaks to a need that is felt, especially by the young people out here. The world is branding them, is telling them things, is having certain expectations of them. And should they be unable to meet it, it affects their confidence and their ability to engage with the world. I think the important thing is for the young people to, first of all, know who they are. Number 2, to know whose they are and why they're here. And I think all those definitions are best gotten from the Word of God. So you think about who we are. The best definition of who we are is found in the Bible. God is the one who created us, and he created us in his own image. So we are the imago Dei. We bear God's image. So it defines who we are, and we belong to him. And therefore, everything we do, everything we interact with, it having that foundation set, I think really helps us have a proper view of how to engage the world, and it gives us a solid basis from which to engage. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think, Dr. Njoroge, that's what Gideon is going through, scared, feeling inferior, not understanding himself. So what does it speak to you?
It's amazing that while Gideon was hiding, God came to him and said to him that he was a mighty warrior while he was hiding.
Yeah.
And the reason is the world tells us a different story. Bill just said we were put in this world for a reason, which is true.
Yeah.
We need to discover that reason. But it needs to be brought out so we can be able to have the kind of confidence that we need to be able to do what God put us in this world to do. The world tells us we can't. The world tells us we can't even know God, we cannot trust God because of this, because of that, because of that. And we buy into those ways of thinking, and that tends to hold us back. So this is a wonderful theme to tell young people and old people, all of us, that we can actually be champions. And the reason we can be is not because of our own strength, is because we serve a God who is sovereign, who is in charge, but who has also come to meet us in this one and to empower us to make us what we need to be. So it is an exciting theme and something that we need to think seriously about, because that's why we're here in this world.
Yeah, and what you're saying is that we are, all of us, including that young person who is feeling scared and confused and not really aware of who they really are. We are all wired to be champions, and God has created ways and means of living out that purpose. We'll get into that later on in the program. But for now, I'm just curious, and I believe somebody out there is curious. Apologists, apologetics, those are big, big words. What does it mean to be an apologist, to be involved in apologetics? What is that?
It doesn't mean that you go about apologizing.
I mean, that's
for
what
being
people would
a
think.
Christian, telling people, I'm really, really sorry that I am a follower of Christ. That's not what it means. Unfortunately, the words have the same root. But what it does mean is being able to give reasons for why you follow Christ, so that others can be able to know Christ as well. The flagship verse for this is 1 Peter 3, from verse 15 to 16a, which says, but in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer, the reason for the hope that you have, but do so with gentleness and with respect. That word translated answer, be prepared to give an answer. That word answer is the Greek word apologia, from which the word apologetics comes. So it's basically giving an answer, giving a response as to why we follow Christ. Jesus in his own ministry did that over and over again, not why he followed himself, but why following him made sense. So he asked a lot of questions, and he allowed people to ask him all kinds of questions. And so it's not something that was invented by some people, some theologians who didn't have anything to do. It's something that is actually expected of us from a biblical standpoint, from the ministry of Jesus and also from the ministry of the disciples, and throughout church history. People have been forced to be able to do this. We've had the advantage here that we haven't had these questions being asked over and over again. But because of the internet, the world has become a very small space for all of us. A question raised somewhere in Karachi or in California reaches you within seconds, and you have it in your hands. So this is not optional anymore. We have to be prepared as followers of Christ to interact with questions that people do have, because it's expected of us.
Wow, it's not apologizing. It's not about when you're apologetic, you're not apologizing.
No, you're not.
No, you're not. But you're giving a well put, structured response to the reason why you believe, and you've said, Jesus did it, Paul did it, all the early Christians did it. We must continue doing it. So, can young people? You work with students. Can young people be apologists?
Absolutely. I actually wanted to interject there and just add a small detail that many of us miss when we read that scripture. There's this assumption that since apologetics is such a big, complex sounding word, and for many of us, you're probably interacting with it for the first time. The assumption is this is for a select few.
Yeah.
It's for those people who've studied in the big universities. It's for professors. So can any Christian, any ordinary Christian, be involved in apologetics? And the answer is a resounding yes. In that scripture, we are all asked, all of us, to be able to get to a place where we are ready to give reason. All of us need to be ready to give reason. But it's even more telling that these words are actually spoken by Peter. And who was Peter? Peter was an apostle, but he was a fisherman. His background was fishing. This was the most common profession in Galilee at that time. So I don't know where you're coming from, but in my village, this would probably be like the boda riders, It's the one profession where you almost don't need any sort of very serious schooling to get into. So these words are being told to us by a fisherman.
Yeah.
If they were told by Paul, who was more scholarly and had gone to all these top institutions and all, then you could argue that it's exclusive to a certain specific select few.
Yeah.
But the instruction is being given by a normal, ordinary believer, so to speak. And I think that is what we need to take note of, that all of us, wherever we are, need to be ready. So for the students in schools, you need to be ready to respond to the questions that other students would have. For those of us in the marketplace, you need to be able to respond to that colleague of yours who is a skeptic or from a different faith, who would have questions regarding our faith. So it's an instruction and expectation for all of us as believers.
Well said. And Peter was not writing to seminary students at universities. He was writing to the church in general.
To the church in general.
To all of us as believers.
Yeah. So it's for all of us.
Yeah.
And actually here we are, actually doing apologetics.
Yes.
Yeah, because today we want to get into those questions, those areas that we leave maybe for those other people, and we want to start asking ourselves those hard questions. We know that from, psychological development, young people, teenagers, young adults, students, learners, are at a point where they're asking very serious and very deep questions, existential questions. Who am I? Where am I heading to? And therefore, even the question of God, questions of faith, actually are more pronounced at this time. This is the time when young people, learners, are getting to, say, high institutions of learning, where they encounter even tutors and, lecturers who really brush off the faith issues and they feel lost. And so I want us to start by engaging with the very first question of the existence of God. How can we be so sure? So I'll put it to us. How do we know that God exists? Dr. Njoroge.
This is a question that has been asked over and over again. It sounds very un-African to ask, because when surveys are taken all over the world, people do believe in a higher power of some sort. People do understand, they have an understanding that we can explain ourselves, why we exist. And people who call themselves atheists are always in a very small minority. The problem is our educational systems are usually set up to challenge God's existence because of a confusion about how science works and all that, and we can talk about that later. But as for how we can be able to be sure and to know that God exists, there are actually many reasons to believe that God exists. For example, if you look at what Paul says in Romans chapter 1 from verse 19 on, Paul says that God's invisible qualities, who God is, can actually be known and understood from what has been made. That looking at the world, the way the world is, we can actually come to know that God is really there. Psalm 19 says the same thing, that the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. So we can be able to know that God is there, that there is something beyond just this universe and our existence in it, and then be able to try and find out what that is. So that's one way of the existence of the universe and its complexity. And we are living in a time today where we understand a lot more about what the universe is and how it works and all that than people before our time did. We have been told, for example, let me give you give somebody who may want to hear a little bit more about this, something to think about. We have been told that the universe came into existence. The entire universe came into existence. That means time came into existence, matter and energy all came into existence, and space. So there was a logical moment in which the universe did not exist. Now you have to ask yourself the question, if the universe actually did come into existence, where did it come from? Because you can't have something from nothing. From nothing, nothing comes. So there must be something that caused the universe to begin to exist. And when you start looking at what that could be, it has to be able to exist timelessly, because it created time, so it cannot be in time. It has to be timeless. It also has to be enormously powerful, given the vastness of the universe. It has to be enormously intelligent, highly intelligent, given the complexity of the universe, and it has to be personal, because it could make decisions. Only minds can be able to make decisions. When you look at these attributes that are being described by the entity that brought the universe into existence, you are talking about the same qualities, attributes that you find described about God in Christian theology, or just in theology in general, what God must be. So the universe itself is pointing us to God's existence. Paul goes on to say in the same book, in Romans chapter 2 from verse 14, he talks about God having written the moral law in our hearts, that we all have this idea that some things ought not to be happening. Injustice ought not to be happening. That when, for example, when money is given to help people who are suffering with COVID-19 and all that, which is the reason we address the way we are right now with masks. When that money is given, it should go to the purpose for which it was intended. That misusing it is actually wrong. We all have that. We all sense that that injustice would be wrong to do that. Where does that idea of right and wrong that is so powerful, that grips us so powerfully, where does it come from? It comes from the fact that God has made us in such a way that we are able to recognize right and wrong, that the universe we inhabit comes packaged with rules of behavior. Do this, don't do that. And then God made us in such a way that we are able to recognize that, and so we can understand morality. Whether we are believers in God or not, we have that moral law written on our hearts. And of course there is the entire history of the scriptures and God's interaction with people that we could talk about. It is not difficult to know that God really is there. But he exists in such a way that he creates space for us to get to know him if we want to, or to not know God if we don't want to. And that's the issue of what is normally called the hiddenness of God, where God has made the world in such a way that we can know him if we want to, but we can also live as though he doesn't exist if we want to do that. And
as we get into that conversation further, Bill, I would like you to start understanding this God who is timeless, able to create this complex universe and keep it going to now, keep it so organized.
He sustains it,
He sustains it. That he's very powerful then, and so good. Because everything that is created, it's so good, we are enjoying, we are beneficiaries of that goodness. Then how comes there is so much evil in this same world? Why can't God stop it? Why can't he just let it be a very good world?
True.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's an important question, right? I think it's a question that every one of us will have to grapple with if they haven't grappled with it as yet. Because pain, suffering, and evil are realities of our existence today. There are certain philosophies and worldview that denounce or renounce or want to argue that pain and suffering and evil is not real, that all these are just illusions. But experientially, our reality tells a different story. You know, I remember growing up back in the village. I grew up in Kitale. My elder sister, newly married, losing her first child. And as a young person growing up, that was very difficult to process. You know, I was wondering. I mean, I was very convicted. God was there. My sister was a believer. So are my parents. We had prayed about this pregnancy and all. Then the kid dies. Couple of years later, she gets a second pregnancy and loses that one as well. Couple of years later, gets another pregnancy and loses that as well. And I tell you, that left me at a very difficult place, just processing the reality of pain and suffering vis-a-vis the existence of a good God.
Yeah.
These are not new questions. Many years ago, a certain Greek philosopher called Epicurus wondered about this same question. And he came up with what is now called the famous trilemma, that either God exists and he is not good, or he exists and is good, but is not powerful enough to stop the evil and pain and all that, or he doesn't exist at all. He argued that it's impossible to have all the three existing at the same time. That you have a good God who is all-powerful to stop all this pain and suffering, and yet there is the reality of pain and suffering. So where do we go from there? You know, and so I had to process that as well. My journey into apologetics also began along the same lines. So growing up, I had those questions really disturb me. And then growing up in the village, I came to the university to high school here in Nairobi. And for the first time, I interacted with someone who claimed to be an atheist. Now, having interacted with atheists, I know he was probably just a skeptic. He had questions about God that maybe no one had answered. But he asked questions that I had never thought through. I mean, how do you reconcile all this goodness of God and all these problems around us? And so I had a crisis of faith in high school. And I began exploring different philosophies of faith, and I asked God if he was there to reveal himself. Long story short, the Lord revealed himself to me. I got very passionate about my conviction in him, and I am here today. So quick response to that question. And unfortunately, this is not one of those questions that needs a very quick response. So I'll probably just point people down the right way, and I'm sure Dr. Njoroge here might add on to this. Number one, could God have created... If you were God, put yourself in those shoes. Of course, it's impossible, right? But what do people say about pain? Number one, maybe God should have created a world without pain. And the answer is, he did it. He created a world without pain, without suffering. This came later as a consequence of sin. And there's something there about choice and why it was important for God to wire choice into the world if love was to be experienced for real. If I'm to truly love you, but there are no options for me not to love you or to love another being, then that love could be brought to question, right? So God wanted to create not robots, but beings who could truly love him. And so he gave them choice. And when they chose not to follow him, not to take him at his word and all, sin was introduced. And as a result of sin, we have all these consequences around.
And just pause at that. Choice.
Yes.
That's one way of explaining that. This is getting deep and very interesting. I want to give you a chance to just grab a glass of water and a notebook if you didn't have one, because I think we need to note down some things. We also need to call our friends, because this is very, very important. So we'll take a short break and we'll be right back to continue with that conversation.
Jeremiah 3 verse 3 says, "Call to me, and I will answer you, and will tell you great and hidden things that you have not known." Join Reverend Elizabeth Kimani and Reverend Henry Kaira here. Take us through the program Call Unto Me every Wednesday from 8 p.m. You can prayer requests through the number 0111 220044 and let our reverence you. Are you worried by the rapidly changing patterns in crime? Are you concerned about the enforcement of the law? Crime Must Fall Show is the latest way to combat crime by bringing together different professionals and institutions in the justice system to critically interrogate factors related to crime both locally and globally with a view of professionalizing criminal justice system. This can only be achieved through a partnership of a vibrant professional body and media. Active in partnership with the Professional Criminologist Association of Kenya brings you Crime Must Fall Show every Tuesday from 8 to 9 p.m. Join us in this exciting journey as we focus on interviewing high-profile stakeholders and panelists in the criminal justice system only on CAC Television, because crime must fall.
Dear viewer, we welcome you back to the Rays of Hope. And today, as we had mentioned earlier, we are working with the Y Summit. This week is dedicated to the young people specifically in the Y Summit, the first really big virtual summit for young people. And today, we are discussing those questions of faith that are really hard, very, very hard for our young people and for all of us indeed. Questions that we really must ask as we get into a relationship with God and as we move on as people of faith, so that we can accept the call to be champions. And that's the theme of the Y Summit. I am a champion. We are being called to be champions. So how do we realize this? We must start engaging and answering these questions, however hard they may be. And earlier on, we expounded on the area of apologetics and what it means, to be able to explain what we believe. And we are called, all of us, to be able to explain the reason why we believe the way we believe. And right here in this panel, we have been able to engage on the question of the existence of God. And we went for a break at the point where we're talking about evil. If God is so good, God is so powerful, then why does he allow evil in our world, including coronavirus? Why, Bill?
Okay. So, I can finish the thought I had begun.
Yeah, please.
Just explaining how, number one, we may say God should have created the world perfect without pain, suffering, evil, and all. And the answer is yes, he did. Okay? But as a good, loving God, he also needed to create beings who had capacity to love. With love comes choice. In fact, someone said, love is probably the only thing that cannot be enforced by power. I cannot put a gun on your head and tell you to love me. I mean, I might say I love you, but I don't really do. So, choice. And because of choice, we chose to disobey God, our first parents. Sin was introduced into the world. And because of sin, all these consequences. Then number two, we may say, then why can't God stop all the pain and suffering? And the answer is he promises to in his time. Again, he lives outside of our understanding of time, as Dr. Njoroge put it. So are there certain experiences that might be painful that you need stopped now, but because you don't have that kaleidoscopic view that sees everything, you therefore want it stopped now, but it serves a certain purpose? And the answer is yes. I'm a parent now, and my kids are going through immunization around this season. And I tell you, some of those are really, really painful. When I take this kid there, the kid must be wondering, what is wrong with this loving father of mine? Why all this pain? I see what he does not see because of my unique vantage point. And so I allow the pain. Will the pain be stopped? Absolutely. So God promises to stop all the pain at some point and restore all that is broken. We may say, then at least I need to know that God empathizes with my pain. He feels my pain. And the answer is, that's exactly what happened with the incarnation. Jesus came, God in flesh. He came and dwelt among us. He was Emmanuel. He experienced all that we go through as humans. He was hungry, he was thirsty, he was rejected. He was actually born in a part of the continent of the world that still experiences the most number of births, you know, in Asia. He was a refugee in Africa, the continent that still has the largest number of refugees. You know, so he went through the experiences that you and I go through. And so, does God empathize with me? Does he feel my pain? The answer is absolutely. And that's why we are told that Jesus Christ is our high priest. He intercedes for us. We have the man Jesus, and we will know him by the mark in his hand, because he's gone through this. But the last thing that God does with our pain, that you and I might never, probably never saw coming, is that he gets into our pain and he transforms it into something beautiful. You know, so that the instrument of pain becomes an instrument of hope. Think about it. The symbol for Christianity today is the cross. Back in the day, the cross was the symbol for torture and harassment, and cursed was one who hung on a tree, you know, even according to the Jews. Jesus came into that and transformed that experience, that pain and all that, into a symbol of hope. When we see the cross today, we see hope. So God does more than just empathize with us. He comes in and transforms our pain and makes it something beautiful. Yeah.
Wow. Dr. Njoroge.
Well, Bill has said a lot of the things that I would have said, but I just want to add, just clarify something that I think is very important that we keep in mind. We struggle with this question of evil and pain and suffering in two main different ways. We struggle with it from a logical perspective. We're trying to reconcile, which is what Bill started. We're trying to reconcile there being a God who is all good and all powerful with the existence of evil. So, and some people will say there's no way to reconcile those two. The reason that's important is because logic is one of the tests for truth. If you can show something to be contradictory, you have shown it to be false. That's an easy way to show that Christianity is false, if you could show that God can't exist because of evil. The problem is, for you to be able to do that, you'd have to show that there's no way God can have a reason to allow evil. And that's not something that has been done yet. I don't think it can be done. We cannot be able to show that God cannot have a reason to allow for something. And Bill gave some good examples of vaccination, where you take a kid to be vaccinated and the kid is there looking at you. You love your child. Your child loves you, and he's about to go, or she's about to go through a very painful experience, and you're right there and you can't stop it. That's a good analogy for God. Maybe we have reasons to allow that, and God might have reasons similar to those that we can understand as human beings. So that's one. We cannot be able to show that God cannot have those reasons. That's so, and to make the logical problem of evil work, we would have to be able to do that. But the second way in which we struggle with the problem of evil has nothing to do with logic, with whether we can reconcile God and evil and all that, but it has to do with our experience of evil, where whatever you are going through is so painful that you are really hurting. That a person who is there is in a very different place. I attended a funeral recently. My niece lost her 22-year-old son, a vibrant young man, and he just had a brain aneurysm, and he died almost instantly. It was a very, very painful experience for the family. During the funeral, his about 13-year-old brother screamed at the top of his voice. He said, "I hate you, God. I hate you, God." Now, this young man was not struggling with the logic. No, not at all. He was struggling with the pain that he was feeling at that moment. So it's very important that we find out where the person is coming from. If the person raises the problem of evil against God, we want to find out where he's coming from, where she is coming from. Because if the struggle is emotional or existential. Trying to give answers like we are doing right now is going to hurt the person more. What that person needs is for you to be there and to be assured of your love and care for them. And they also need to be assured of God's love and care for them. And there's no better place to find that than at the cross of Jesus Christ. So the Bible answers that as well. But then this other issue is also extremely important because we are testing truth, but we handle the two in very different ways. Yes.
So there's the logic part of it, and there's the real experiential, really, a part of it. And we cannot ignore that pain.
Exactly.
It's real.
Yes.
And we all go through those moments. It doesn't mean that we don't believe in God, but we go through those moments. And now, this brings us to the question of a big, powerful God, creator of the universe. And therefore, even science then is part of this. But then sometimes science has been used to disapprove some facts of faith. So I want us to get into that. Science and faith. Does science disapprove God? Does science disapprove faith? You want to take it up?
Okay. Yeah, that's actually one of the problem of evil is the number one reason raised against God's existence, the problem of evil. The second one is usually science, doubts raised by science and all that, because we seem to be making all these different kinds of discoveries, and then God seems to be out of a job every time we make a discovery. I remember when I was growing up, maybe my sister is watching, her name is Mary, and I asked her, I was a little kid, I said to her, what is lightning? What is lightning? And she said to me, that is God taking pictures. Now, when she says it's God taking pictures, that was a kind of a strange answer that she gave me. But I was very young. I was actually satisfied. I believed her. I thought that was true. But then I came to find out that lightning has nothing to do with God doing anything. It's just differently charged clouds and coming together, and that's the charge that is what produces the lightning, the electrical charge that we call lightning. Now, if following her logic, once science explains to me what's really going on, I don't need God anymore. And so people think, or what we do when we talk about God, we are using what is called the God of the gaps. We have gaps in our knowledge, and so we use God to fill in those gaps. And because of that thinking, every time something is discovered in science, people conclude God is out of a job again. So the more we know about the world through science, the less we need God. But that's the wrong way of thinking about what science is, or even what science does. That is not, there are people obviously who think that way, even believers, but that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Because what science does something very different from what explanation about God does. Science explains how things work, how things fit together. But that says nothing about whether or not God was involved in making it. It doesn't have any. One is a personal explanation. The other one is a physical explanation. If you walk into a room, this is an example given by some famous scientists. Walk into a room and you find somebody boiling water. In the kettle of water boiling, and you ask, why is the water boiling? A very smart scientist can be able to tell you what's going on with the heat and the molecules and everything. That's why the water is boiling. But if you ask the person there, why is the water boiling, they say, I want to make a cup of tea. Now, it's not that one is wrong and the other one is not. They're just different explanations. Or if you were to take, for example, a car, a Ford vehicle, and you take it apart and you figure out how it works and all that, it doesn't follow that the person who made it doesn't exist. Those are very, very different things. So once we know how things work, to know how something works, it's not the same thing as saying that it wasn't made, or that there was no engineer, or there was no creator of it and all that. And that's the confusion that is there. Science, actually, we are living in a time where science itself points us to God in a very powerful way. We talked about the beginning of the universe. We've come to know about that because of science. Its complexity is because of science that we come to know that. We are not using God to fill in gaps
Yeah.
in science that we don't, of things that we don't understand. We are appealing to God to explain what we do understand.
Yeah.
It's what we know about science
Yeah.
that cries out for an explanation.
Yeah.
You talk about the complexity of the DNA molecule, for example. We live in a highly complex world that was put together, and even people, scientists who are not believers in God, are puzzled by this. And give you an example of an astronomer when looking at the beginning of the universe, and he said there is really no way to. His name was Robert Jastrow in the U.S. He said there's no way to understand what we are discovering about the universe without an intelligent mind behind it. And if I can quote him, he said, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He's about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians and Bible scholars who've been sitting there for centuries, because the Bible already gave us that storyline about what we're going to find." And I'll finish with this one thing. In order for us to go out and do science, we know science developed in Europe, in a particular geographic area. By the year 1500, for example, the world knew no more about science than the Greeks did hundreds of years before. But within that's 1500, the year 1500. But with the year 1700, only 200 years later, Isaac Newton had mapped the laws of motion. And scholars began to ask themselves, what happened within that 200-year period that caused that such a big change? And the conclusion was that they began to think about the universe and about the world and about themselves in a very, very different way. Alfred North Whitehead, who was a very respected scholar at the time studying this issue, he said the reason that happened was because people in Europe began to believe that the universe was put together by a God who has a very strong, powerful mind, and who made us in his image, and so we could think his thoughts after him. And so they went out and did experiment after experiment after experiment, and ended up producing modern science and technology. In order for you to do that, you have to believe that the universe follows specific laws, that those laws are discoverable, and that what goes on in our mind mirrors what's happening in the world. And so that scientists can sit in his office and work out equations and all that, and then find out that those equations, if they're done correctly, they actually match what's in the world. And that match between what's in the world and what's going on in our mind cannot be explained with apart from the fact that we were made by a God who made us in his image, made it possible for us to think his thoughts after him. That doesn't mean there are no problems, no issues. We are finite beings, so there are issues we have to clarify and study over and over again, and that's what's happening. But to say scientists has disproved God is to ignore the facts of how science works.
And actually that reminds me, the whole essence of, you're talking about this band of theologians who already knew all this all along. And I'm reminded that even theology is a science. And because it's God talk. It's God talk. But as opposed to other sciences where you put something under some controlled environment for investigation, in this case, you cannot put God in a laboratory to study God, because God reveals himself to us. And so, as you're saying, we all need, even that scientist, top scientist, that astronomer, that scientist, needs some basic belief in order even to scale the heights of their knowledge.
It's not possible to do anything meaningful without faith.
Without faith. So can we know God, Bill, as you build on that?
We are all people of faith. The only variance, the only difference is the object of our faith. If you say you have no faith, that statement itself is a faith statement. You have faith in your lack of faith, so to speak. So we are all people of faith. And I'd just like to point out that what you hinted at.
Yeah.
The whole question of how science is done and how things are proven,
Yeah.
factual through the scientific method,
Yeah.
is legitimate, but it's not the only way that people arrive at truth.
Yeah.
Science, unfortunately, the scientific method has a straitjacket. Yeah, there's a certain way that you arrive at the conclusions.
Yeah.
But the question is, are there certain truths that can be arrived at differently? And I think he also talked about the analogy of water boiling in a house.
Yeah.
Are we discussing two different? Are these two different ways of explaining phenomena? And the answer is yes. But allow me to also just mention here that many times those who don't believe in the Judeo-Christian worldview have argued that Christians especially would check their brains at the door as we get into church, that there is this huge gap between science and faith. You cannot be a man of science and a man of faith, that those are mutually exclusive. That cannot be further from the truth. I just finished reading a book by Professor John Lennox, who is a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford and one of the world's foremost apologists. I'm sure Dr. Njoroge knows him probably personally. And he argues that if you look at the Nobel Prizes for science, and he did a research for between the year 1900 to the year 2015, Nobel Prizes for science, on average, 65, I think, 0.4% of all the scientists who've won awards in this area actually claim faith, hold on to faith.
Wow.
Of the Christian sort or otherwise, but they are men of faith. Yeah. And if you look at the breakdown, like I was looking at, I think physics is more than 70%, chemistry recipients is more than 70%. And around the world today, we could mention names of scientists who are foremost believers. Gentlemen like Dr. Francis Collins, who was the head of the Human Genome Project. This is a team that helped map out the DNA in the mid-90s. He is a man of faith. He's an apologist as you know, as of today. So it is erroneous, it is wrong, it's fallacious to argue that you cannot be a man of faith and a man of science. Last example, even people who are not of faith, but have pursued science and have committed, as Saint Augustine said, to follow truth wherever it would lead. Objective people have come to these conclusions. One of the interesting ones was a research published a few years ago in the European Astrophysics Journal by a scientist called Erik Zachrisson, who is a professor at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, not a believer. And he was mapping out using computers the improbability of life on planet Earth. And he talked about intelligence of the design around us and how that points out a creator. His model found that the probability that life would occur on planet Earth as it does now is 1 to 7 quintillion. Now that is 7 followed by 20 zeros. That is the improbability of finding a planet like Earth with all the conditions right for life. Tilted at 23.5 degrees. If it was tilted slightly different, if you adjusted that by a microscopic, variance, you would not have life. And I could go on and on about the constants of physics, of the complexity of the DNA in biology, of the findings we are discovering in cosmology and other areas of science. And they all, for any objective person out there, rather than disprove God, like Dr. said, they actually begin to point us towards the possibility of the existence of a God.
Wow.
A gentleman, I forget the name, the guy who wrote There Is No God,
Antony Flew.
Antony Flew. He was a famous atheist, debated Christians in the 70s, 80s. He'd written a book called There Is No God that was a bestseller. Until the Human Genome Project mapped out the DNA. And a couple of years later, he spent time studying the DNA and all that. I think in 2004 or so, he came to a conclusion that truly there must be a God. And so he simply republished his book, crossing out the no to say, so there is a God.
There is a God.
And he was on a journey. He subscribes to deism, which is not exactly what we believe, but the conclusion that there truly is a supernatural being who caused all these things to be.
No, this conversation really it's deep and it's getting very exciting, and it has to continue. And during this WISE Summit, a lot of time has been dedicated to that, deepening our understanding on this and even asking these hard questions. And we truly hope that even on our platforms, you are raising questions and you're giving your comments and all that. I want us to begin winding up. And as a parting shot, can we know God? Bill,
Yes.
and how?
Yes, the answer is yes, we can know God. And I think this is probably the most important question.
Yeah.
That if there be a God,
Yeah,
if there were to be a God who is not knowable,
yeah,
then really
Yeah.
it would make no sense. But God has revealed himself to us through the person of Jesus Christ, his son, through the created order
Yeah.
around us.
Yeah.
But I especially want to talk about Jesus Christ. And for anyone out there who's asking, can I know God?
yeah,
God created the world. We can't establish that. He loves us.
Yeah.
The reason why he created us
Yeah.
in his own image is because he loves us.
Yeah.
But there was the problem of sin. Because of our choice, we chose to sin,
Mm.
and because of sin, we fell. Romans 3:23, Romans 3:10,
Yeah.
Romans 6:23.
Yeah.
The wages of this sin is death. So we are separated from God.
Yeah.
And there can be no way for fallen man to reach out to God
Yeah.
apart from God taking the initiative to reach down to us. And he did that by sending his son, Jesus Christ, who died on the cross. And if we place our faith in Jesus Christ, the righteousness of Christ is appropriated on us so that we can get to believe in Jesus Christ
Yeah.
and begin a relationship with God.
Yeah.
So it's possible to know.
It is possible to know God.
Yeah.
On knowing God, as you give a parting shot.
Yeah, I think because of what we've been talking about here, about science and philosophy and theology and all those things,
Yeah.
somebody out there might feel this is going to be a lot of work if I'm ever to know God.
Yeah.
It's really not that. You don't have to do all the things we've been talking about
Yeah.
to know God. All you have to do is go to God
Yeah.
and ask him to reveal himself to you. For example, pick up, for example, the Gospel of John and read it seriously. And ask the questions.
Yeah.
Any question that comes up that causes doubt in you or whatever happens, just go there with an open mind.
Yeah.
Not open in such a way that you are close to counter arguments,
Yeah.
but open in such a way that you are honest,
Yeah.
that you really want to know whether this is true or not.
Yeah.
And God will speak to you. You can come to know God that way, and the Holy Spirit will testify to you that you really are a child of God, as the scriptures tell us. So God hasn't left no knowledge of him to specialists who have all the time in the world to look at all different kinds of arguments, but to any human being who's willing to know him. Like we said in the beginning, he made us in such a way that we can know him if we want to, and we can stay away from him if we want to. And if we really want to stay away from God, you can be able to know all the arguments we're talking about now, like some people do that we debate. They know those arguments, but they still stay away from God. So we can be able to know God because he's made it possible for us to come to know him, and he's revealed himself to us through Jesus Christ, and we can walk directly to him and talk to the living God. And then from that moment on, we begin to grow in our knowledge of him.
Wow, and what a beautiful point to end at. That God has revealed himself to us, and we can take the initiative we should take the initiative to know God. God is a relational God. God is a loving God. And yes, God exists. Science does not disapprove God. There is evil in the world, but that doesn't mean that God is not powerful and able and loving. Please watch out the space for more engagements on this issue this week and even beyond. So this is the Rays of Hope program, inspiring courage, resilience, and hope. And we are in the WISE Summit week. A lot has been prepared for you and I. So let's plug in, and at the end of it all, we'll be better people. We'll become the champions that God has called us to be. Thank you very much for finding time to be with us. Thank you, viewer, for taking time to follow this program. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you.